It's past, so let's make a start. Thank you for coming, post-lunch. Everyone in the right room. This is the strategy deployment talk. If you want the other talk, it's in Braceli. Hate to discourage people and send people out, but hopefully you're here for the right talk. As I say, this is an hour and a half session, and we will be getting into an exercise, so again, just a word of warning if you're planning on slipping out after 45 minutes to go to something else. We're going to be moving around, so don't make yourself too comfortable. We're going to do some work in groups halfway through, roughly, maybe a bit before that. And I was anticipating having a room with tables in it, which you might observe we don't have any. So I'm thinking probably we'll just use the stage as a giant table and kind of just get a little spaces. So you're going to be coming down to the front and getting on your feet later. For now, I'm kind of interested to find out what your thoughts are, what you know about strategy deployment, if anything. So have a read through those 3 questions and just pick one of them that you're interested in. So not all 3 of them, just pick one of them. And then find 3 people in the room that you don't know and go and ask them that question. So you should end up with around about 3 answers to one of those questions. And then when you've got your 3 answers to your one question, sit back down again, and then I'm interested in finding out what you've learned from your fellow colleagues, attendees here. Okay, so pick one question, go and find 3 people that you don't know, ask them that question, make a note of the answers, and then I'll be finding out from you what you found out. I'm going to come down so I can hear the answers. So who picked the first question? Who got answers to the most important facts you already know? You want to shout out some of the answers?
Well, they're all the same, really, which was, don't know any facts about
okay.
All right. Kind of, yes, everything at once.
Okay. Did anybody find out some facts from the people?
Well, not quite facts, it's more observations. But a couple of us do nothing
right.
on the first question. And some of them it's like needing a flexible approach, and thirdly, it's sometimes it can go very wrong, and exactly the same approach can go very right. So yeah, and I'd agree with both of those. And I'd also say I do find strategy deployment is a body of knowledge that's just not widely known. Hence why I'm out there trying to kind of bang the drum about it, because I think it's really useful. What about the second one? So something you want to learn. Who want to shout out some answers you got?
How to do it successfully.
Okay.
A complete overview of what it looks like and how strategy deployment looks from the top of the organisation. Mm-hmm. How far does it go down to the bottom of the organisation? How far does it go back up?
Okay. Yeah. Hopefully I'll answer those questions. Although, as the gentleman over here, successfully, it's no silver bullet, but how to do your best. Sorry. Any other answers to this question?
Yeah, okay, we've got this one. So we wanted to understand strategy execution, how the deployment of the strategy, and how to shape the strategy and make it.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I think we can cover that. Anybody else pick this question? Have any other answers? What is it? Okay, yeah. Yeah, kind of ties into the first one. Don't know anything, would like to learn what it is. Fair enough. And then maybe the third one, why is strategy deployment relative to this conference? Anybody pick that one? No? Okay. Well, I'll touch on that as well. So actually, let's start off with that, really. So this was a couple of quotes that I pulled out of an article on BBC website just after Leicester won the Premier League. And actually, given we're in Cardiff and Wales' progress in the European Championships, I think probably you could replace Leicester for Wales in this, and the same would apply. so the top one is about empowering the players to make decisions for themselves rather than ruling over them. When they're on the field, the Leicester players, they knew what their primary goal was, they knew their strategy, and therefore they could figure out what to do themselves. It wasn't like, oh, we've got to do in this formation and follow these things, and we can't think for themselves. And that was obviously perceived to be a significant difference from Leicester with other teams, which I thought was surprising. And then the other one, while some clubs work in silos, Leicester's backroom teams have drawn together to help turn the club into winners, despite competing with clubs with far greater resources. So again, quite surprising you'd think about a football club, but obviously traditional football clubs work in silos, but actually they broke down those silos. So they had kind of cross-club, cross-organisational collaboration with clear strategy, clear goals, clear purposes, so that everybody could make the right decisions for themselves on what the right thing to do is. So those two things to me kind of sum up what I think the essence of strategy deployment is, allowing the whole organisation to work together with a clear strategy, clear goals, clear purpose, such that everyone can make the right decisions. Everybody's empowered and enabled to make the right decisions in order to meet the strategy and get the desired results. So typically, I see Agile as a tactic. So this is why I think strategy deployment is relevant for the conference. And this is where I started with Agile. Agile is a great tactic. It's something that we can do, something that we can teach. Do Scrum, do TDD, do XP, do Kanban. That's very tactical things to do. And then we kind of moved on from that and we realised actually it's not about doing Agile, it's about being Agile. So I think of Agile, being Agile is more about we want to achieve outcomes which are relevant to being Agile. So there are things like we want to be releasing more frequently, have more continuous deployment, we have more customer collaboration. Those are kind of Agile outcomes. But actually I think of having agility is actually a strategic decision. In order for our organisation to be successful, we need to have greater agility. And if we can think of that as a strategic thing, then we can start saying, if we're implementing agility as a strategic initiative, therefore we should get these Agile-related outcomes, and we can achieve those outcomes by using these Agile tactics. So you want all three. It's not that one is better than the other. They're just all three equally interdependent elements. And the end goal is we want the business to be successful. We want to have business impact, or we want our business to have an impact within its market, an impact on its customer base. In order to do that, we think we need greater agility. If we have greater agility, we'll have these outcomes. To get those outcomes, we need to do those tactics. And those are the four kind of core elements of the model that I'm going to describe. And if we go back to some of these elements in the quote about Leicester, these are very Agile things. Empowering people, allowing people to make their own decisions and not be micromanaged and not being told what to do. Collaboration across the organisation. These are all very Agile friendly things, so it all fits together really nicely. So we're trying to avoid this. Let me go back to the beginning. People seen this before? Alright. So there's no sound on this video, so don't panic. So people familiar with that sort of scenario? Somebody comes in and says, right, we're going to do SAFe, we're going to do the Spotify model, we're going to do Agile. And if you just focus on the doing piece of it, you're probably not going to get the benefits on it. We need to think about what do we do, and also what outcomes do we want? How do we know whether it's working or not? How does that tie in with the organisation strategically, and actually what's the organisation trying to achieve, what the end results? That's put together by a guy called Jason Little, and it's on YouTube. The URL's there if you want to use it. So strategy deployment, few definitions then, to kind of just to what is it? The literal definition is the one down at the bottom. So it comes from the term hoshinkanri, which is Japanese, like all good ideas. Hoshinkanri translates literally as direction management, or that's a pretty close word-for-word translation. So it's about setting direction. We want to manage the organisation in the direction, and what we're managing is the direction, not the journey to get there, not the individual steps, not the kind of precise route, but we want to go in that direction. If we all know we're going in that direction, then we can all figure out how to get there if we're working together. So direction management is the literal one. The one at the top is from a guy called Pascal Dennis, who wrote a good book on strategy deployment. Ship in a storm going in the right direction. I kind of really like the metaphor that invokes, the image that invokes, the idea that your organisation is a ship, and the ship's in a storm. The storm being the competitive landscape, the disruptive technology, the economy, all these things going on which are going to potentially sink your ship, sink the organisation. And what you want to do is make sure everybody knows, for the ship to survive, we need to get to safe harbour. If we get over there, that's where safe harbour is. That's a clear purpose, a clear direction, and we want to go in. And everybody on the ship pulls together to get the ship out of the stormy water into safe harbour. So I kind of really like that as a rich analogy. We're trying to get the organisation. We've got some idea of where we think is a safe place for the organisation to be, where the organisation can be successful. Let's get everybody working together to get to safety, to get to where success is. So this is my definition. So it's any form of organisational improvement in which solutions emerge from the people closest to the problem. So it's not strategy deployment isn't a specific method, and I think this is why it's quite challenging to explain what it is, because there are many ways of doing it. The key aspect of it is that it's solutions emerging from the people closest to the problem. So having clarity on what the problem is, and saying to your organisation, let's solve this problem, but I'm not going to tell you what the solution is. But if I'm very clear on what the problem is, I think that the organisation, the people at the coalface, people doing the work, they're the people that know best how to solve the problem. So again, it ties in very closely with Agile. Obviously it's a very lean, it's kind of what we talk about with Kanban. To me, it ties in with the work that Dave Snowden's doing with Cognitive Edge and SenseMaker and Kinevin. That's all about running experiments, allowing the people to run experiments, allowing your workers to run experiments, rather than telling them what solution is. We're working in a complex world. So within complexity, we can't just predefine, pre-impose a solution. We need to allow people to figure out and allow the solutions to emerge. Again, it's solutions emerge. It's not that we're allowing people to identify the solutions up front, that we're running experiments, we're seeing what works, what doesn't work, and we're kind of slowly guiding ourselves towards success. So yeah, I mentioned Dave Snowden. Who knows Kinevin? So come on. So we're in Wales. Who knows what Kinevin means? Who knows that Kinevin is a Welsh word? Excellent. So Kinevin, place of multiple belongings. Actually listening to keynote this morning talk about, you're the golfer. Well, I'm one of a number of golfers, and I'm many other things. That's kind of, to me, that's actually the essence of Kinevin. So I can say, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a speaker, I'm a runner, I'm many things. So our organisations are, have these multiple identities and multiple dynamics going on. So on this side we have ordered domains, obvious and complicated. On this side, I'll kind of do a really quick run through of this. Obvious and complicated, they're ordered domains that are good practice or best practice that we put in place. We can use our expertise or just use common sense to say that's the right solution. Because of these kind of what Dave talks, tight or governing constraints. On the other side, we have unordered. And the main one of these is the top one, where we have complexity. So here we have constraints. Well, if you don't have any constraints, you have chaos. But they're more enabling constraints. So this is where we want emergent practice. So this is allowing solutions to emerge. Going back to, if we go back to, the old days of scientific management, Taylorism, old school manufacturing, that was trying to treat manufacturing as a complicated problem where the managers knew what the right solution was and the workers just need to follow the best practices that the managers defined. But we don't work like that anymore. Arguably, what Toyota's insight, I think, was that actually even manufacturing isn't complicated. I mean, retrospectively, I can look at what Toyota did with the lean production system and say Toyota's biggest insight was that manufacturing isn't complicated, it's actually complex. So they moved from saying, you know what, managers don't know best, even when we're manufacturing cars. The workers know best because they're the people doing the work. So therefore we want our practices and our ways of working to be defined and to emerge from the people doing the work. So this is what we're trying to do with Agile and Lean, and ultimately it's what strategy deployment is. It's saying our organisation is complex. By putting a strategy in place, we're going to put these enabling constraints in place. So I think of strategy as being an enabling constraint which guides us in the same direction, tells us what direction we're heading in, but gives freedom to come up with appropriate solutions. So difference between governing constraints and enabling constraints is key in here. The enabling constraints, the bottom one, that's what we use for strategy, that's what we use for complexity. And it guides what could be. It doesn't tell you what to do, it tells you what you could do, what you might try, but it's not saying try anything, so it's guiding you on that. It's also telling you what you shouldn't do. So a strategy that applies to anything isn't a strategy. A strategy should say, we should do this, we could do this, because it applies to the strategy, we shouldn't do that because it doesn't apply to the strategy. This is governing constraints. Governing constraints are very tight. They basically tell you what not to do. Do this, don't do anything else. So the tighter the constraint, the less freedom you have. The more protective you have. So the picture there is a starfish. That is an endoskeleton. Starfish has an endoskeleton. We can think of the endoskeleton, that's the internal skeleton, same as what we have, as an enabling constraint. It constrains our growth, but we still have freedom to have all sorts of different types and shapes and sizes of bodies. Constrains us generally to having 2 arms and 2 legs, but actually even that constraint is sometimes broken. Versus the governing constraint, which is an exoskeleton. So that's a hard shell on the outside, like a crab or a snail. That's very protective and limiting. You can't grow outside of that shell. So we want strategy to be like an endoskeleton. Keeps everything coherent, ties everything together, makes things recognisable still, but gives us lots of freedom to try different things out. I'm just running through some kind of basic ideas and models to explain strategy deployment, and then we'll get into an exercise to try and use a tool to put it into practice. So another model, Helmut von Moltke. He was the Chief of Staff of the Prussian Army for about 30 years, generally regarded as being the person who kind of invented current military warfare approaches. So he said, so previously, generally the general model was that alignment or autonomy were 2 ends of a single line, and you could have one or the other. If you had high alignment, you got high alignment by telling people exactly what to do, therefore you had no autonomy. Or you could have really high autonomy and anybody could do what they like, but therefore you would have no alignment. Helmut von Moltke's insight was that actually they're 2 different axes, they're not the same scale, so you can have high alignment and high autonomy. You have high alignment by making intent really clear. If the intent behind why you want to do something is really clear, then people can take action and have high autonomy. So there's 2 bits of strategy deployment, and we're only going to cover on one of them, touch on one of them today. You get autonomy by a process called catchball, and this is a kind of a mechanism within which the teams and people across the organisation collaborate. What we're going to focus today on is how you get alignment across the whole organisation. And there's a framework, a model called the X matrix. And this is what we're going to drill deep dive into, and you're going to have a go at filling in. This model, coincidentally, maybe not so coincidentally, I think actually matches really nicely with Dan Pink's Drive model. I think I saw some tweets saying one of the talks this morning was playing Dan Pink's TED Talk video. So he talks about extrinsic motivation in terms of autonomy, mastery, and purpose? Well, autonomy is the same on both. Purpose and intent, pretty much two different words for the same thing. If you allow people to be good at their jobs, to do their jobs, you use their skills with autonomy to a purpose, you have mastery. So I think there's a really close correlation between the model that Dan Pick talks about and strategy deployment in terms of this model. There's a guy called Stephen Bungay who talks about this model. He's a British military historian who went off and studied the military and basically does business consulting based on military expertise. So what he said was, von Moltke and the Prussian army guys basically discovered how to run a business centuries before we're just kind of rediscovering the same stuff now. So effectively, he's describing strategy deployment. So he has this model. This is Stephen Bungay's model of military. He calls it directed opportunism. Again, it's just a different way of describing the same thing. So he has three elements. He says there's outcomes that you want to get. In order to get those outcomes, you have plans. You put plans in place. You implement those plans with action, and those actions will lead to outcomes. And there's a loop there. And there's some gaps between each of those. So the gap between outcomes and the plans is the knowledge gap. So there's the difference between what you'd like to know and what you actually know. So you base the plan on what you actually know. But there's probably a gap between what you'd like to know, what you don't know, and what you do know. So that's the knowledge gap. Then you put a plan, and that plan gets put into action. So now you have the alignment gap, because there's what you want people to do and what they actually do. So the difference between what you want people to do and what they actually do, there's a gap there. And then you've got the gap between action and outcome. So this is the effects gap, because there's the gap between what you expect to happen and what actually happens. So you've got three gaps in there. And if we want to have kind of a smooth running machine, so really, really high performing organisation, those gaps cause friction. So the typical way of solving this problem is this. To solve the knowledge gap problem, let's have more detailed information, let's do more upfront analysis. And to close the alignment gap, let's have more detailed plans, give people more instructions so they follow the plans better. And in order to close the effects gap between the actions and outcome, we need more controls, more metrics, more reporting. So, more and more of everything. And generally doesn't work that way, So again, lean and agile, we're trying to go the other way. So this is what Stephen Bungay calls directed opportunities. He says you should shift in the other direction. For the knowledge gap, you actually want to limit the information, limit the direction, and just communicate intent. You don't need all that information. If people know what the intent is, they can come up with their own plans. And then you allow people to come up with their own plans. You don't tell them what the plan is. So you allow each level in the organisation, each group, to come up with its own plan. And then he has this notion of back briefing, which is when you put a plan together, you say, here's our plan, here's how our plan meets the intent. So you make sure you've got clarity that the people understand the intent and that the plan should meet the intent. Back briefing is similar to catchball. It's just making sure that you're getting feedback cycles in there. And then the effects gap is once people start putting the plan into action, you give people the freedom to adjust the plan and to change tack as they get that feedback. So you're doing less precise, less detailed information and more freedom. Yeah, this is what strategy deployment is about. Right, so this is the model. So I'm now going to drill into the way I think about it, and this is the model behind a format called the X matrix. So we'll introduce the model, then we'll go into the X matrix, and then we've got an exercise. You're going to go in and fill one of these things in. So the first thing we need to have clarity on is what results we want to get. What does the end game look like? What does winning look like? So that's ultimately, what's the safe harbour do we want to get into? What does success look like? We need to start with that. In order to get that success, then what are our strategies? So in order to achieve these results, we want to implement some strategies. And if those strategies play out in the way we think they do, those strategies to lead to some outcomes, and those outcomes will generate our end results. Okay. Fairly simple model, except that going from strategies to outcomes is a huge leap. So actually, we take a strategy, we implement the strategy with tactics. So if strategies are the enabling constraints, they're kind of quite loose but guiding. Tactics, much more detailed, much specific. So we do tactical things in order to implement strategies, and it's actually those tactics that generate the outcomes. So then we can say that if we use these tactics, we think we'll get the results. That makes sense. So this is the kind of core model behind this that I'm going to go into. Any questions on that? So economic model. Strategies then, I said, they're constraints, they're enabling constraints, and they should guide decisions. Your strategy should allow you to make decisions and decide what you should do versus what you shouldn't do. But they're not the decisions themselves, they're more a model to help you make decisions. Then the tactics, that's the actual activity that we do. The things that we do, and at this level, tactics should be experiments, because we don't know whether these things are going to work. Actually, all of these things are experiments, actually, or certainly hypotheses. So you can think of your results as being, we have a hypothesis that if we achieve these results in 12 months' time, we will be successful. There's still no guarantee. It's just a very big hypothesis. Equally, we think if we use these strategies, we think we'll be successful, but it's still a hypothesis, we don't know. Once we get down to the tactical level, now we're getting down to some small hypotheses and things that we can start testing and getting rapid feedback on. So very much in experiments, and now I think of these as the investments that we're making. We're now spending money on doing these tactics, performing these activities and running these experiments. And then the outcomes are the evidence of whether the activities and the experiments are running. So if you think of the tactics as being experiments, the outcomes tell us the results of the experiments. So they're more leading indicators, the results lagging, outcomes leading indicators. They should tell us ahead of time whether we're on track or not on track. So that if we're not on track, we can try some different tactics, or we can change our strategy, or we can reset results. So we want to get early feedback. And outcomes, I think, have been more about the capabilities of the organisation. So strategies are generally solving problems. To solve problems, we need new capabilities. So how can we know whether we have those capabilities? Typically, these are outcomes are metrics, but I don't like to limit to metrics. To use the language from the keynote this morning, outcomes are your dominant narratives. If we're getting more stories like this, we think we're going to be successful. We think we're getting the results. We're going to get the results. But if we're still getting stories like this, probably we're not going to get these results. So there's a subjective and a qualitative and a quantitative aspect to this, subjective and objective. And then in these four corners, you've got the idea of correlation, coherence, and contribution. So there's not a real simple mapping between all these four elements. You've probably got multiple results, multiple strategies, multiple tactics, multiple outcomes. What you want to make sure is that you do have correlation, that you can tell a coherent story about how a tactic implements a strategy and how a tactic should create a new or a different outcome, how that outcome is going to generate the results. And it's about contribution, so it's many to many. So one tactic might contribute to multiple strategies. And if a tactic correlates to multiple strategies, it's probably coherent. So the way we actually do this is on this form. So this is the X matrix form. It's typically an A3. We'll actually work on bigger ones, but again, the idea coming from Lean and Toyota. Actually, this didn't come from Toyota, but it came from the lean organisations. Single page, nice and concise, but visualising what we're doing in a kind of really simple way. And being an A3 is something that we can have a conversation around. So the idea is here is that it's a format that we can start talking to each other around, making sure we have a shared understanding, a common understanding, and where we don't, we can highlight that quickly and easily and cheaply. So we have the results, strategies, tactics, outcomes. There's a number of kind of rows for each of those. This form has 3 results, 3 tactics, 4 tactics, 3 strategies, 4 tactics, 5 outcomes. That doesn't mean that's the number you should always have. That's just the way I created the form for the purpose of an exercise. I would say you don't want to have too many. So I would probably recommend not having more than 3 strategies. Again, if you have more than 3 strategies, your focus is going to be too wide. And it becomes too easy to justify anything. So if when you're going through this, you're finding, well, we can justify any tactic in terms of a strategy. They're what a colleague of mine called strategic horoscopes. You know, a horoscope, you look at a horoscope, and horoscopes are written such that any event will apply to them. Very clever like that. So if you have strategic horoscopes, it means your strategies are written in such a way that anything you do will meet the strategy. So they're too enabling. So it probably means you just need to constrain them down a bit more. So that either your strategies are too vague, or you have too many strategies. Tactics, it's just like limiting work in process. Focus on a small number of things, get the feedback on them, figure out whether things are working. The correlations then are the interesting bit, and so this is why it's called the X matrix, because you have the 4 correlations in the corners. Each of these squares basically maps, so up here, an outcome to a result. So you've got in each of the corners the many-to-many relationships, and you can fill in then in those little squares. The very simplest level is there correlation between this tactic and this strategy and this result. So you can start seeing a pattern. If everything correlates with everything, then I would be very suspicious. What you're actually looking for is probably where there are gaps, where you might have tactics that you're doing that actually don't correlate to a strategy. Or maybe you've got a tactic that you're doing that doesn't correlate to outcomes. So I've got an example of that. So we fill in these, we start talking about, let's make sure we understand what our results are. How would we describe the results we want to get? And at this point, I might be putting numbers in there, or percentages, percentage increase in net revenue, or percentage increase in number of customers, or you might put an absolute figure. Then what are our strategies to do that? And what's the correlation? How does this strategy help us make those results? Then I prefer to shift to outcomes, and if we do these strategies, what outcomes do we want? And then jump to tactics last. Now I like to jump to tactics last, and it's difficult because it's very easy just to dive in with I know what the right answer is. I'm going to put these tactics down and then justify them in terms of strategies and outcomes, and you might not be the right tactics. So it's kind of like the design thinking, that divergence convergence. By leaving the tactics to last, you can go through some convergence thinking and thinking about strategies and outcomes, divergence thinking, and then converge back into, okay, what tactics do we do? So we're going to fill one of those in. Here's a really simple example. Let's start off with just the kind of one of each. Let's say we want to increase our revenue by X%. In order to do that, we think we need to pursue a strategy of focusing on fitness for purpose. So we really want to understand our customers' needs and make sure that we're meeting our customers' needs and we're fit for purpose. Fit for the purpose our customers come to use us for. So the solid dot there means that I think there's a strong correlation. Really direct. If we have a better fit, if we're more fit for purpose, if our product has a better fitness for purpose, we think that will directly correlate with increased revenue. As a tactic, actually no, let me move to outcomes. So if we have better fitness for purpose, we think an outcome would be improved Net Promoter Score. Are you familiar with Net Promoter Score? Those surveys where you get, would you recommend this to a friend on a scale of 1 to 10? So we think we would have an improved Net Promoter Score. Now what I'm saying is that there's only a kind of an indirect or a not so strong correlation between improved Net Promoter Score and increased revenue. It's not strong, but there's some correlation in there. So I've just kind of got a 2-level scale here of kind of strong, weak. So there's weak correlation, but I think there is a correlation in there. So tactically, we're going to do a metrics initiative. So we're going to focus on improving our metrics within the organisation And I'm saying that if we have better metrics, we will get an improved Net Promoter Score. Strong correlation there because, well, improved Net Promoter Score is a metric. So, but I'm saying, well, metrics itself doesn't directly relate to fitness for purpose. There's no really strong direct correlation in there. But again, I'm saying that there's some correlation in there. Now, you might disagree with some of those things, and actually that's the point. By putting that up there, we can now have a conversation around, are these things the right things? Is that correlation right? Do we want to change anything? So we might fill the rest of the form in with multiple strategies, multiple tactics, etc. With the correlation. So where there's a blank square in the correlation, that means no correlation at all. So I've got sort of medium-ish, weak medium, and strong correlation. So now I can look up and let's look at the second tactic up there. That's only got a weak correlation with the third strategy and no correlation with the other ones. And it's only got a strong correlation with the third outcome. So that could mean a number of things, a couple of things. Firstly, is it the right tactic? Maybe there's something better that we could be doing tactically as an organisation, something better to invest in that has better correlation to the strategies and more direct correlation to the outcomes. That's one thing we might talk about. The other one might be, well, you know what, I still think that's the right thing to be doing, so maybe we're missing a strategy, or maybe we need to revisit the strategies, maybe the strategies are wrong. Or maybe we're missing an outcome. Maybe there's something else we should be measuring and looking for to tell us that this tactic is working or not. That second approach feels a little bit kind of like retrospective coherence and trying to justify tactics, so I'd be a bit wary of that. But it's a valid thing to do. I've done it before. The other thing, and the other sort of conversation you get, and once we go into the exercise, hopefully you'll experience this, is, well, what's the difference between a tactic and an outcome, or a tactic and a strategy, or a strategy and a result? Is that a strategy or is that a result? Just having those conversations is extremely useful. And again, when I've done this with organisations before, we started off with something as a tactic, and we realised, you know what, that's not a tactic, that's the outcome that we want. So if you've got an outcome, improved NPS, and one of your tactics is implement NPS, probably not so useful. Your tactic is probably something a little bit different that will lead to improved NPS. So it's really about having that clarity, having that shared understanding, and having those conversations. So we're going to go into an exercise. I've got some printouts of this, which is just a kind of an overlay of the kind of the arrows model I had and some of the boxes on that onto the X matrix basic format. One thing you'll notice on this, if you're if you're paying attention, on outcomes, the top line there is indicators. On the previous slide, I had evidence. I'm constantly changing my language on this as I talk to people, as I get feedback. So I used to talk about indicators as leading indicators. I'm still trying to find the right language for outcomes, because usually I find I have to explain what's the difference between an outcome and what's the difference between a result, because surely isn't a result an outcome? Well, it is, it's just a lagging outcome rather than a leading outcome. But I've started using the language of evidence more, because it ties in nicely with the idea of hypotheses and experiments. But also, it's the language I use here is significantly different from the language that's used in the source book on the X matrix. That's very manufacturing. Actually, outcomes, it talks about process, it's really process heavy. So I moved from process to improvements to indicators to outcomes and maybe evidence next. So again, play around with whatever language you make sense. It's a model, it's a framework to figure out how do you use this within your organisations to try and have these conversations to get alignment to enable the autonomy. All right, let's get into the exercise. I've talked too long. So we'll do this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. So we've got 15 left. So we could do, say, 3 groups of 5, or maybe groups of 4 and groups of 3. So. What similarities? Are there any similarities between the different X matrices that people looked at?
Each had an X.
Yeah, they're all the same format. That's a good thing. Were there any similarities? Were they all pretty different?
There's like a lot of them basically results in more revenue or more.
Right, so results tend to be revenue related, yeah. Okay. Anything else? Okay, what about differences?
Some are more vague than others.
Okay.
Like, I think you mentioned earlier that we should maybe not do them too vague so that we don't say that they can fit anything, and maybe by having them vague, people then struggle to kind of match them together.
Right, yeah, so if they're too vague, I think if I done 246 calculate. If they're too vague, then yeah, when you come to do the correlations, there's just everything correlates with everything. So that usually shows up there, whereas the tighter you have it, the easier it is to kind of, I think of it as telling a story, you know, and then if you kind of go, we're doing this by all of these things and all of these things, it's just not a very compelling story, is it? So the more compelling you can tell the story by having slightly tighter definitions. And, you know, though that list was deliberately vague anyway, to try and make it harder. But to have more interesting conversations. Okay. And any surprises? Sorry.
I was surprised at how conservative we were, particularly on the results. So the results were very vague, not very tangible economic results coming out. So it wasn't the operational cost, the increased revenue a lot. It was sort of the better brand recognition kind of thing, which was a bit conservative, and I was a bit.
Okay. Yeah, and that's always that's usually a conversation that comes out, or a discussion that is had around, is brand recognition an outcome or a result? And it could be either. So I'm kind of glad there were lots of differences, because actually, you know, one of the things with this is there's no right answer. The only answer is an answer that you all understand and agree with. So again, does it matter whether a brand recognition is a result or an outcome? I don't care, as long as we all agree what it is. You know, so even if I might kind of go, well, for me, brand recognition is an outcome. You know, if I was going to argue it, but as long as everybody agrees that it's a result, and then it's focusing everybody, then that's probably the more important thing. Yeah. Any other kind of either similarities, surprises, differences? Okay. So I've got a few kind of just slides to wrap up, to hopefully try and put this into context then. So, a couple of slides just to kind of hammer home this point. So Thomas L. Jackson is the guy that wrote the book on the X matrix. I've got a reference to it at the end. It's well worth a read, but with a large caveat that it's very dry and it's very expensive. But there's some nuggets in there, and it's because it's really manufacturing focused. But he has this quote: "It's the memory of what's said and felt, what was said and felt that creates the alignment, not the final piece of paper." So hopefully you kind of get a sense for that. It's the conversations that you had that were filling it in and explaining it to people that gives you that really sense of shared understanding. So to me, this is similar to what Jeff Patton talks about. So people read Jeff Patton's user story book. So he uses the analogy of a holiday photo. So it says if you look at a holiday photo, it's just a picture. But if you were there when the holiday photo was taken, it's got much more meaning to it. So, you know, this is actually a picture of my daughter on holiday last year. From a photographic point of view, it's a pretty crap photo. But it was a really fun evening, you know, in a phone party by the pool in the hotel. I had a great time. So that means so much more to me than it would to any of you, because it's my daughter and I was there. So again, being there, being part of the conversation is gets the value and the alignment. A very similar quote. So Durward Sobek wrote a book on kind of A3s in general, so more traditional A3s as a problem solving, but similarly the idea that it's just a single piece of paper. He has this quote, and this is the second bit of that. It's the process of creating the report that becomes the value of the thing. So it's the process you go through, the conversations. That's where the real meat of this is. It's not in just creating a document. This is This is a picture from when I first started using the X Matrix. So this is when I worked for Rally Software 2 or 3 years ago. I was working with the Office of the CTO. I was working with Gene Baker, who sadly passed away a few weeks ago, and we kind of rolled out the X Matrix as how we would do strategy deployment within Rally. So you can see there's about 100 people in that room, including 5 to 10 customers, going through filling in an X Matrix. So we kind of got people from the whole organisation, hierarchy spanning, hierarchy bridging, so all breadths, all depths of the organisation, so trying to get a really wide representation of everybody. And this is what we created. So we actually built out a huge one of these on the wall. You can see from the size of the post-it notes, that's just a regular 3x5 post-it note. Again, we did things slightly differently. So play around with the general pattern and the general format. We actually went in with 7 strategies. So the exec team came up with, they kind of narrowed something like 30 possible strategies down to 7. And then as a result of getting the organisation involved in this process, that 7 was narrowed down to 3 by getting feedback from the organisation. Again, there's something like 10 tactics, we call them rocks. So the metaphor that if you've got rocks and stones and pebbles and sand, and you want to get it all in a jar, you put the rocks in first and fit everything around it. So just again, variation around the language. We came up with a whole load of stuff. They are doing buying. If we could do the correlations for all of this stuff, we could see the stuff that was most coherent, had the best correlations, and that's the stuff we should focus on. So we actually used it as a kind of a filtering prioritization mechanism. There's a more complex version of this that we've done, not touched here, that looks at the people side of things. So where it says departments, I find that just over complex. It's complex enough, the form as it is, to kind of start getting your head around without introducing that. But again, if we're trying to figure out who's going to work on these things, we can add that dimension to it as well. So this is how I tend to use it, and it's a multi-layered thing. So what we're doing here is kind of, very big picture, and that's to some extent why it's a little bit vague, because, we're kind of big organisational stuff. And actually to get down to what people are doing on a day-to-day, you need to do it at multiple levels. So I'm normally going into organisations as an Agile coach or an Agile consultant, and it's kind of, we have an Agile transformation going on. So I think of that as a mid-level thing. We're doing Agile, so I'll start figuring out what an extra matrix might look like. And sometimes I'm just doing it in my head. So again, that's why I kind of take the model from the form, because the model is useful even if you don't fit in the piece of paper. So I'm start thinking about, what results we're trying to achieve, how does this tie into strategically, what improvements or what outcomes are we trying to make, and then how are we going to go about this. So tactically I'm probably thinking, do we go after a particular customer, a particular project, a particular location, if it's a multi-site business. And then we can drill that up a level. So actually the Agile transformation is probably a tactic within a much bigger organisational transformation. And if we can make that link, we can now start talking to the wider business around how Agile fits in with all the other things that are going on within the organisational transformation. So an organisation I'm working with now, this Agile transformation, but they're looking at improving their relationships with marketing, though. So they kind of got a whole marketing and a sales transformation. Well, we want to see how these things link together, and those things should link to a similar strategy. So we can go up and we can start fitting it in our Agile transformation within a wider business transformation. And suddenly now we're talking about business transformation and not Agile transformation. Equally, we can then drill down a level and say, well, let's say we decide to start with a particular customer. So tactically, we're going to do Agile with a customer. Now what are we doing at that level? So now we might be saying, well, let's introduce some particular methods, let's introduce some specific practices, let's introduce some specific techniques, tactical things to do. We want, across those 3 levels, to be aligned, similar strategies, focusing on achieving similar results, and all kind of looking to make the same sort of improvements or achieve the same sort of outcomes. So it's a hierarchical thing, it's a kind of a multi-level thing. It's not just a single form. So typically you would take, let's say we've got one down here, we've got a tactic around DevOps. We'd create a little team, a DevOps tactical team, And they would go off and say, okay, how are we going to run our DevOps? What are the next level tactical things we need to do? And how do those things help with our outcomes? How do those things relate to our strategies? So you should see similarities. You might get some subtle differences because you might find that DevOps doesn't relate to a strategy, and you can take that off. And you want to build a cadence around this. So we would do this at this level, at Rally, on an annual basis. Annual strategy, annual results, and what do we want to be in 12 months' time. But then feedback cadences, just like we do with Agile. Let's look at the outcomes, and if we've got metrics, let's review the metrics every couple of weeks. And probably quarterly, so at Rally we had quarterly steering. Let's see where we are every quarter and just check in, are the strategies right? How are the strategies working? So we did have one quarter where we got to the, 1 year, we got to the end of the first quarter and we went, you know what, our strategies are wrong. We need to go back and redo the strategies. So this is all kind of getting feedback, so different levels of feedback, and it's this taking this unpredictable and using Cadence to make it more predictable. So the Don Rylanson quote. So these are the 3 books that I kind of really recommend reading. This is probably the simplest one over here, getting the right things done. So this talks about strategy deployment more generally, doesn't talk about the X matrix, but introduces some of the kind of basic concepts and models. Then Hoshin Kanri for the Lean Enterprise is the X matrix Bible. That's the dry, expensive one. You get a CD with it though. So, no, it's a CD with a whole load of PDF and Excel templates on it. So you get an Excel template of an X matrix with a whole load of other A3 templates in it. So it's more than just the X matrix, but that to me is the meat. And then The Art of Action. This is the Stephen Bungay's book around taking the lessons learned from military history and applying it to business, which is just to me, he calls it directed opportunism. It's just another flavour of strategy deployment to me. So it's got some good ideas and some good models in there. And we've got 2 minutes to spare. So I'm around, so questions now, or I'm around today, rest of today or tomorrow if you've got questions. Thank you for participating. If you don't mind, I'm going to take photographs of these things and tweet them. Yeah.
I've done quite a lot with impact mapping,
Yeah.
kind of feature mapping, and this seems to have a similar kind of format of getting a discussion and having a
Certainly impact mapping, there's a lot of... So the thing with impact mapping I find, what I like about this, that impact mapping is kind of a one-to-many. Generally you're creating a tree.
Yeah.
This isn't a tree, it's a matrix. So this is slightly less reductionist. But it's a great tool for doing this sort of stuff and potentially figuring out what your strategy is. So again, what this strategy deployment doesn't tell you about is how to figure out what your strategy is or what your tactics should be. It's just a framework for thinking about what pieces should we have and how they fit together. So yeah, impact mapping is actually, I find it potentially a good way of figuring out what strategy is, what strategy might be.
And would you normally write a goal from after you've done the X matrix, kind of a more wordy goal to
Yeah, so again, there's an element of lean, which is called the true north, which is that kind of really concise statement, which really kind of says what the direction is. Yeah, I would probably look to have one of those statements as well, which just kind of overarches the whole thing. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.